All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, in classic New York Times fashion, I eagerly opened this column, which purported to explain why progressives should not despair, only to find an argument accidentally making the case for complete despair, at least if you're an economic populist. Allow me to explain. The argument that columnist Jamelle Bouie makes is essentially this. Progressives should look to my home state of Virginia for hope of how they might be able to advance important goals in a potential Biden administration. In Virginia, progressives backed an anti-establishment populist named Tom Perriello for the governor's mansion, only to come up short to an establishment moderate named Ralph Northam. Yes, that Ralph Northam of blackface infamy. Jamelle argues that, yes, Northam was a disappointment, but progressives helped to take over control of the state's two chambers and now wield some power within the state for really the first time. Here is Bouie. Northam is still governor, and most of the caucus is either moderate or conservative. But for the first time, progressives have a major say in policy, and they have used it to push an unabashedly liberal agenda through the legislature, raising the minimum wage, legalizing collective bargaining for public employees, and expanding the right to vote. Just last week, Virginia lawmakers led by Lee Carter of Manassas, a member of DSA, passed one of the nation's lowest caps on the price of insulin. First of all, please reflect on the fact that there would be any resistance from any Democrat on issues as basic and central to supposed democratic principles as a minimum wage hike, paying for insulin, or people literally being able to vote. Now, without boring you with all the legislative details here, suffice it to say that each of the economic items on this supposedly unabashedly liberal agenda were massively watered down by corporate Democrats whose allegiance remains with the donors and companies that fund their campaigns. But nowhere was the agenda more stripped down than on the issue of workers' rights. As one example here, yes, technically, Virginia Democrats legalized collective bargaining for public employees, but with massive caveats that completely outrage their union allies. First of all, it maintains the ban on collective bargaining for state employees, something that only exists in 3 states in the entire country. Second, doesn't even guarantee collective bargaining rights for local government employees. It only gives each locality the ability to vote to allow those rights. And finally, strikes are still illegal. So the reality of what this unabashedly liberal provision has meant for these workers so far is absolutely nothing. More disappointing still, though, is the fact that when given the historic opportunity to roll back right-to-work legislation that makes it nearly impossible for workers to organize, Democrats took a hard pass, led by blackface Governor Ralph Northam, who promised to veto the legislation if it came to his desk. Think about that. It may be worth mentioning as a side note here that unlimited corporate campaign contributions are perfectly legal in Virginia, but I'm sure that has nothing to do with the way that these people routinely screw workers in order to cater to the corporate bottom line. But I digress. By the way, I've spoken with some of the organizers and union leaders who've been trying to push pro-worker legislation in the state, and they told me they have no hope of repealing right to work anytime soon. As one told me bluntly, the corporate Dems are not pro-working class. But don't despair, progressives. It all sure looks quite familiar, doesn't it? Democrats doing the bare minimum to call themselves friends to the working men and women, but still expecting them to line up to vote D in the fall. Now, I can understand why an identitarian like Jamelle Bouie may find much to like about the priorities of the Virginia Democratic establishment. Instead of prioritizing worker rights, they focused on virtue signaling efforts like taking down Confederate monuments and passing the ERA, issues that will have zero actual impact on the economic interests of zero people. But they do make the professional managerial class feel good and virtuous and progressive while preserving the economic status quo that is working very well for them. Thank you very much. Far from providing hope, this spells out precisely the outcome that those of us who are economic populists most fear, a party that centers itself around the interests of the affluent. As friend of the show Matt Cart put it, Jamelle Bouie is right that we shouldn't give in to despair, but it's hard to swallow the Virginia Democratic Party as anything but a dystopian vision of liberalism's future, fending off the hard right with a suburban agenda that safely preserves the status quo, $12 minimum wage, partial public collective bargaining without strikes, a blanket rejection of right-to-work repeal. This isn't half a loaf. It is no loaf at all when adjusted for inflation. It's actually amazing how little liberals at the Times understand about the actual left. But I'm sure Jamelle's audience there, disproportionately made up of Pete and Liz types, does find this Virginia PMC agenda comforting. For the rest of us, I suggest looking to another state for some hope of how to win and center workers, my adopted state, the Commonwealth of Kentucky. As I covered here, current Democratic Governor Andy Beshear was able to pull off a major upset victory by focusing like a laser on pensions, healthcare, and labor rights. Voters in the suburbs backed him by overwhelming margins because of the nastiness of his opponent, Republican Matt Bevin. But Beshear's narrow margin was secured because he was able to win back some of the historically Democratic coal counties in the east of the state. Look, the Democratic Party brand with working people can't be changed overnight. But Beshear's victory showed if you focus on bread and butter, they will give you a chance. So while reading the New York Times may often lead us to despair, Jamel is right. There are, in fact, plenty of reasons to be hopeful for the rising populist left and how it can remake what's possible in politics. It was actually hysterical for me to read this because, I've been following Virginia
and you
for a
turned
while.
Me on to that, and we had that.
Right.
We had Lee Carter
on to talk about it because I knew when they took control of the legislature and they had run on repeal right to work, I was like, there's no way it happens because it's a suburban party. Even the so-called progressives in the party toe the corporate line and preserve the status quo and don't really care about workers' rights.
They're culturally progressive. They're not economically progressive. And
that's
what
exactly
it's all
right.
about.
It's all signaling.
I loved what you pointed out. And by the way, that's what the Democratic Party is going to be with Joe Biden as the nominee.
Now you are making me despair.
I'm very happy about it. But
and that is precisely the thing that we most fear. And he's like, look, it's going to be fine.
That's what they want. They're going all in because they're like, well, in the suburbs, they won in the. And again, yeah, you can win the House with the suburbs. You know where you can't win? The presidency, because there's actually a lot of working people all across the Midwest and in other swing states that you're going to need to win in order to do this. And this is the funny part about that is actually the party that they want. The Democratic Party, like I think I said this yesterday, under Joe Biden, what they want their electoral coalition to be is loyal African-American voters, suburbs, and rich people. That's what they want. Yeah. They want Wall Street donors in order to fuel the party. They want the suburbs in order to turn out to vote because they hate this norms-breaking president. And then they want African-American voters to just fall in line, and then they can do lip service to them through some of the elites that they have. And look, I get that. I don't blame anybody for how they vote or whatever. No. But in terms of the actual interests, what are they doing? That's a perfect example. Equal rights amendment and not doing right to work. I mean, this is something that they are allegedly all for. But when we talk about on the show, when it all comes down to, and why you have to evaluate candidates, is what are you actually going to do when you're in power? What can we trust you to do when you have the pen in your hand? There's only a discrete number of choices that you can make whenever you're part of the government. Well, what did they choose to do? They chose to cater to the Northern Virginia suburbs who they want to feel good about themselves. Man, look at us in Virginia. We're so progressive. We passed this equal rights amendment. And meanwhile, people in Southern Virginia who are workers and have had a hard time or, in unions and have been busted and all that, what's happening to them?
Yep. It's all about who put you there, right? Virginia Democrats got into power because of the suburbs. Mm-hmm. That's who put them there. And so you are absolutely right. And what we see at the national Democratic level is the same frickin' thing. Yeah. We will cater to their interests, and we will just tell the black and brown working class, you have to stick with us because at least we're not racist like those guys. Yeah. And that's it. They take them for granted. Right. They just say, we're not going to serve your economic needs. We're not going to fight for workers' rights. We'll pay some lip service to it. We'll put it as priority number 100 on the list where we never get to it. We never actually fight for it, but you have to stay with us because you have no other choice.
And then don't be surprised that 35% of Latinos vote for Trump. I think it'll go higher. It could go up to 40.
Don't be surprised when people stay home. Yeah. I mean, we talk all the time about, the African-American men in Milwaukee who stayed home and didn't vote for anyone.
And didn't care.
And didn't care. I mean, when the reporter came and asked them, do you regret it now that you see the reality of Trump? They're like, no, because it wouldn't have really, for my life, it wouldn't have been any different with these people in power instead. And so, when people get upset about, me criticizing Joe Biden and saying, what does a vote for him really mean? This is why, because for working class people, in terms of their economic interests, what does Joe Biden even stand for? Literally, what is he even going to do in office? I have no idea. Mm-hmm. No idea. Because the whole party has come to stand for nothing other than sort of symbolic cultural token.
Well, I loved how they were coming at you, and it was like, we'll talk about this later, but I guess we can talk about it now, which is that they were like, what is this stunning white privilege? And I was like, you know what?
By the way, they also accused Cenk of white privilege, which he's not white.
Nice.
Nice word, guys.
They were like, basically trying to say that you didn't understand the existential stakes for people of color in this country. I actually think we understand their existential stakes much more than a bunch of people whose, let's be real, their existential stake is their grift, going on TV, going around purporting to speak for people of color and their interests and boiling everything down to identitarianism and ignoring the actual economic realities of these people's lives. So in my view, that's what the existential grift, the existential threat really is to their power and their ability to speak on behalf of people.
You have to love Soledad O'Brien, who is a multimillionaire Harvard grad, lecturing anyone about privilege. And you know what? She's right. I am incredibly privileged. I will be the first person to tell you that, and I will use every bit of power and privilege I have to always fight for the working class. That is my commitment.
Well,
I don't think she could understand
Thanks,
that.
Soledad.
Next, we're going to talk about the global market chaos surrounding coronavirus when Rising continues.